Ladies and gentlemen, just to make an announcement that we should commence with our proceedings in the next 5 minutes. So please be comfortable and find your space as we try to settle the technical side of the program. So in the next 5 minutes, we will officially commence with the proceedings for this morning. Thank you very much.
Viva profesores, viva Cherished, Polytechs, viva Cherished, Polytechs.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I almost said good evening. Good morning, and you are all welcome to this auspicious occasion. Let me start off by introducing myself. I am the program director and the facilitator for this lecture. The name is Alex Mtiane. I'm from Gagasi FM. It's an honor to be part of this initiative. Organizations coming together for this good cause, the Hiso Trust, together with one of South Africa's leading universities with a heritage that keeps pride of the people we celebrate, such as one Beyers Naudé. Ladies and gentlemen, before we commence officially with our program, just two announcements to make. If you could all kindly switch off your cell phones, rather put them on silent. And because the second announcement is related to the first one, it wouldn't be ideal for you to switch off the cell phones because we will be tweeting, we will be posting on the social networks as well. And the hashtag that we use is Beyers Memorial Lecture. That's the hashtag we'll be using, Beyers Memorial Lecture. Let me then request you, Bishop MTB Makanya, which is a benediction before we start with the business of the day. Baba Bishop.
I'm going to read from Isaiah, the first chapter, verse 17. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and fight for the rights of widows. Let us pray. God our Father, you are the source of all truth, peace, and justice. As we begin these proceedings in honor of your 7 Beyers, we ask you that you go before us and encourage us with your continual help, that in all that we are about to do may be blessed exceedingly. Inspire with your wisdom and strength those who will take part on these proceedings. Lord, we also beseech you that as we commemorate your 7 Beyers, you may look with pity on those who are threatened by hunger, injustice, terror, or death. Help us to be agents of change as your servant was, so that we may banish cruelty from our midst and purify our hearts from all hatred and prejudice and strengthen those who seek equality for all. And finally, we ask you that you guide us by your loving wisdom, that peace, justice, and righteousness may be established amongst all your people. We ask all these through Jesus Christ, an advocate for peace, justice, love, and equality. Amen.
Thank you very much, Your Grace, Bishop Makanya, for allowing that we observe protocol the right way. Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite our first speaker, we would like to acknowledge the University of Zululand community led by the Vice Chancellor. Thank you for hosting us together with the entire delegation. And again, acknowledging the chairperson of the Kagiso board, the CEO, as well as the team. And again, the speakers and the respondents that will be invited later on. And the Nodie family that is here, the stakeholders of the university, and the guests and participants who are joining us via a live feed. You are all welcome. It gives me great pleasure then to invite the Vice Chancellor, Professor Mtose. But before I invite the Vice Chancellor, we have a brief video that is going to give us a broader understanding of what initiatives Kagiso Trust is involved in, and together with how pertinent is the celebration of Beyers Naudé's life is to us today. So let's watch this video, and then after that, I'll be inviting the Vice Chancellor to give us her opening remarks.
The Kagiso Trust, in partnership with the University of Zululand, are proud to host the 2021 Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture, a capacity-building platform that tackles leadership issues. The Kagiso Trust has been hosting the Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture since 2003, with different universities across the country, and these have been delivered by well-renowned speakers, such as one of our founding fathers, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, Minister Naledi Pandor, former Public Protector Advocate Thulima Donsela, and former President Thabo Mbeki, just to name a few. The 2021 keynote will be delivered by Professor John Lamola on the topic, Born Again into the Struggle for a Non-Racial, Just and Prosperous South Africa. Masilela John Lamola is an associate professor of the philosophy of technology at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Intelligent Systems and the founding chairperson of the Research Group on Africa, Philosophy and Digital Technologies. Besides his frequent public engagement on contemporary South African politics, his research interests are on the intersection between social philosophy in the context of the emergence of African modernity and the philosophy of science and technology. Join us virtually on the 19th of October 2021 for this pertinent and important lecture, Kagiso Trust, Overcoming Poverty.
Well, thank you very much. Let me now invite the Vice Chancellor to give us the welcoming remarks on behalf of the University of Zululand. Let's give her a warm round of applause as she proceeds to the podium. Thank you.
To the Master of Ceremonies this morning, thank you. Chairperson and members of Council of the University of Zululand, CEO of Kagiso Trust, the Chairperson of Kagiso Trust, members of Kagiso Trust Board of Trustees, Executive Management of both Kagiso Trust and the University of Zululand, the Deans of the faculties, with special appreciation to the Dean of the Faculty of Education, Professor Ndombela, who was involved in organizing this day, members of staff of UniZulu and our students, the Naudé family and friends, our guest speaker, Professor John Lamola. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you once more in one of a series of Dr. Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture. The lecture has served as an annual pilgrimage for those who have sought to seek insights and wisdom of the legendary theologian. Dr. Naudé has contributed immensely to the struggle against injustice in this country. I have zeroed in on the idea of justice deliberately. It is important to recall that while everyone seeks to talk about the rule of law, the apartheid government was also rooted in law, in the same way that the system of slavery was. But for those of us who were on the receiving end of the apartheid laws, we knew all too well that these were unjust laws. Despite it being established in law, slavery, colonialism, and apartheid were declared crimes against humanity. Dr. Naudé, unlike many of his contemporaries in the white society, chose a path less traveled. He found common cause with the downtrodden and the heartbroken in the keeping of what his faith was all about. We are today richer because of his contributions. It is this that the reason this University of Zululand delightedly accepted to host the Dr. Beyers Naudé Memorial Lectures for the previous years and today. Dr. Naudé belongs to that rare species, the best human beings that made the times in such as this that are beautiful to all of us as South Africans. These are the individuals that rose to the occasion when the moment demanded that Dr. Naudé took the side with those persecuted by apartheid. In taking this stance, he did what was expected of true Christians or true Christianity. He rejected the bastardization that apartheid had turned Christianity into. It was in the churches and in our own universities that some tried to find some pseudo-philosophical theological justification for apartheid. People that were Christians and are Christians even today are still not getting it, that it is a crime against humanity to be a racist. Cognizant of our interconnectedness, Dr. Naudé understood what other theologians and leaders of United States civil rights movement leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he said, open quote, "I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and to be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anyway is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly," close quote. The threat to justice is all around us. It starts manifesting itself through what happens to others. Today, many apartheid beneficiaries, those that voted it in, election after election, pretend that they never supported or benefited from the system. It is that failure to acknowledge injustice perpetrated against others that robbed us of our humanity. The words of Martin Niemöller, a theologian who stood up to the Nazi rule ring, true to the, as it is then. In his reflection, Niemöller had to say, first, they came for socialists. I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I thought today I should lay the foundation for today's lecture by Professor John Lamula, because Professor John Lamula belongs to the school of thought that it says it's not enough to condemn injustice, that takes place in our midst. It is our sacred duty to take active steps to confront them. Professor Lamula's topic, pardon me if it sounds a sermon, will take us through what it means to be born again into struggle for non-racial, just and prosperous South Africa. We trust, as the trust, Kagiso Trust hopes, that through these lectures, we have been able to provide students with opportunity to be exposed to interesting topics related to societal values, higher education, and leadership in honor of one of Kagiso Trust's founding patrons, Dr. Naudé. We trust that in hosting these lectures, we have contributed to the Trust vision of providing a platform that encourages these difficult conversations to seek out solutions for the betterment of the society. I would like to leave you with a quote which would help each one of us to define what role we should play in our society. The quote is credited to Nicholas Murray Butler of Ohio. He states, open quote, "First, there are those who make things happen. Second, there are those who watch things happen. And third, the vast majority who have no notion of what is happening." We know which category Dr. Beyers Naudé belongs to. I don't know which category you belong to. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the University of Zululand for the 2021 Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture today. And I hope you enjoy and you learn many more lessons, because I would like to take this opportunity as a Vice Chancellor of this university to thank the family and thank the Kagiso Trust for trusting us as a University of Zululand in the deep rural area of Zululand, that you could trust us and say, we're taking the next 4 years to this university, and we have done it. And today, this is a testimony. Keep going. Thank you very much.
The welcoming remarks delivered by our host this morning, the Vice Chancellor. Thank you very much for the enlightening words. And I did observe, Prof, that you must have been from the Faculty of Arts, judging by the way you use words and the rhythmic sound of Kagiso Trust, trusting us. So thank you very much. Even though I got worried somehow towards the end of your presentation when you mentioned that your university is located right in the deep heartlands of Zululand. So we have the chairperson of the trust joining us via a stream. So people often associate poor network connections to places in rural areas, but maybe you will defy the stereotypes, at least over the next 2 hours. Thank you very much. The Vice Chancellor of the University of Zululand, Professor Mtose. Let me then invite the partners, stakeholders in this initiative. The words in response and remarks coming from the chairperson of the board of Kagiso Trust, Ms. Mankone Ntsaba, is going to deliver her speech via a live stream feed. Over to you, chairperson.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Mr. Alex Mtiani, the Vice Chancellor, Prof. Mtose, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Prof. Siepe, Dean in the Faculty of Education, Prof. Ntombela, our guest of honor, Prof. John Lamola, our discussants for today, Prof. Masucha and Ms. Tessa Dooms, a trustee of the Kagiso Trust, the CEO of Kagiso Trust, Memankodi Muizi, trustees and staff of Kagiso Trust and the staff of the university, the Nodia family, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to the 2021 chapter of the Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture series in honor of Reverend Dr. Beyers Naudé, one of the founders of Kagiso Trust, about 35 years ago. Kagiso Trust is one of South Africa's leading development agencies working towards a prosperous, peaceful, equitable, and just society. This is our vision as a trust. We work to overcome poverty by developing and implementing scalable, replicable, sustainable development program models in the areas of education, institutional capacity building, socio-economic development, and financial sustainability. Over the past 35 years, we have invested over 2 billion rand in development and implemented over 1,800 programs. In the words of Dr. Beyers Naudé, we never will get a full situation of open transparency, but we should seek to bring forth the major concerns about injustice and suffering and dishonesty. This needs to come into the open, or there will never be peace in the hearts of us, the violated. Close quotes. These were the words of Dr. Beyers Naudé, and these words gave us a creed to live by. He wanted all South Africans to speak truth to power and to shine a light on the inequalities and injustices left by the legacy of apartheid, to help the people who need our help most, which are the poor and downtrodden. Reverend Beyers Naudé, Ombey, as he was fondly referred to, was a founding patron of the Kagiso Trust in 1985. How he lived his life, his convictions and compassion remain the moral compass of the trust. We work to overcome poverty and make real and lasting impact in the lives of the poor through our development programs across the country. We do this regularly by asking ourselves, what would Beyers Naudé do? I think we should keep on asking ourselves, whenever we do our work, what would Beyers Naudé do? That is what the Beyers Naudé lecture series has asked us to ask ourselves since it was first held in 2003. Today's talk by Professor John Lamola will speak directly to where South Africa finds itself now and what we can do to return to the ideals embodied by struggle icons such as Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu and Dr. Beyers Naudé and other patrons of the trust. This raises a set of interrelated questions about the name of the memorial lecture. Why memorialize Dr. Beyers Naudé? That's one question. How can his legacy be preserved so that it benefits the present? And how significant is it that the memorialization is commissioned by Kagiso Trust? How do the two names, Kagiso Trust and Beyers Naudé, function in contemporary dialogues and conversations? As a development agency that works with the poorest of the poor, we see daily how the alarming state of our society affects those who need our help the most. That is why, as a self-funded sustainable organization, we have invested over 2 billion in development programs in an attempt to break the cycle of poverty. Ombey was an open, honest, and caring man. He was born into a conservative Afrikaans family, and his father was the first chairman of the Afrikaner Broederbond. As a dominee, he had questioned the Dutch Reformed Church's support for apartheid, believing it was unchristian and immoral. We have heard what the Vice Chancellor has just been talking about earlier. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960 affected him deeply, and was a turning point in his life. He left the Dutch Reformed Church, famously hanging up his gown in the church after his last sermon. Many of those who read about Dr. Nodier know about that story. He was ostracized by the Afrikaner community and called a traitor. He, however, continued to work tirelessly in the struggle against racism, preaching and helping the movement, staying true to his convictions even when he was banned from 1977 to 1985. Upon his unbanning, he became the founding patron of the trust. It was an intense period in the struggle. The trust opposed apartheid by supporting development institutions and initiatives. Ombey was a shining light during those early years, giving direction and support. He was the person that all of us should aspire to be. And so today, as you listen to the lecture, I call upon us all to ask two questions. What would Beyers Naudé do? What can we do as we are being born again into the struggle for non-racial, just and prosperous South Africa? Each one of you should begin to answer that question. What should we be doing, being born again into a struggle for a non-racial, just and prosperous South Africa? Thank you very much for attending this memorial lecture.
The words coming from the chairperson of the board of the Kagiso Trust, giving us a challenge that we can take back as we continue to grapple with the day-to-day challenges of South Africa. And again, the learnings that we can get from Ombey. Thank you very much, Chairperson. And I hope certainly when we do the questions and answer session and get to engage on the presentation that will be delivered by Professor Lamula, some of the questions that you just posed will be attended to. Let me then invite Professor Ntombela, who is the Dean in the Faculty of Education. She is going to give us the introduction and getting into the business of the lecture itself. And then after that, we will then have the actual lecture delivered by Professor Lamula, Dean of the Faculty of Education, Professor Ntombela. Thank you.
The South African cleric and activist Beyers Naudé was one of the most important white voices opposed to South Africa's exclusionary system known as apartheid. Naudé came to believe that Christian beliefs could not be reconciled with a racist system, which discriminated against Black South Africans. After leaving the Dutch Reformed Church in which he was raised and ordained a minister, Naudé formed the Christian Institute of Southern Africa. Ombey, as he was affectionately known, was born on the 10th of May 1915 in Gauteng and passed on the 7th of September 2004. As an anti-apartheid stalwart, the 19th of October marks the anniversary of Beyers Naudé's banning. This is also the day that Kagiso Trust celebrates the spirit and ethos of this giant.
Vice Chancellor and your executives, Kagiso Trust CEO and your team, Naudé family, ladies and gentlemen, students of the University of Zululand, good morning. It gives us great pleasure to welcome you to this fourth Beyers Naudé Memorial Lecture at the University of Zululand. As we were preparing for this day, and I took the pleasure and the leisure to go and dig the archives as to who this Beyers Naudé was. Normally we hear names and we know this was a struggle icon, but sometimes you don't have all the information about who the person really was. So as I read about this giant, I realized that here is a person who lived a life that mattered. And how do we know a life that matters? I don't know if you've read Michael Josephine's poem about what will matter. As I read it, I could see that Dr. Beyers Naudé actually lived a life that matters. I'm going to read the poem. Pardon me, because when it begins, it sounds very sad, but it's a very inspiring poem because it encourages you to begin to look into your own life and see whether you are making a difference, and it spares you to try and focus on things that matter. So Michael Josephine's poem is titled, What Will Matter? And he says, ready or not, someday it will all come to an end. There will be no more sunrises, no minutes, hours, or days. All the things you collected, whether treasured or forgotten, will pass to someone else. Your wealth, your fame, temporal power will shrivel to irrelevance. It will not matter what you owned or what you owed. Your grudges, your resentments, your frustrations, and jealousies will finally disappear. So too, your hopes, your ambitions, plans, to-do lists will expire. The wins and losses that once seemed so important will fade away. It won't matter where you came from or what side of the tracks you lived. It won't matter whether you were beautiful or brilliant. Even your gender and skin color will be irrelevant. So what will matter? How will the value of your days be measured? What will matter is not what you bought, but what you built. Not what you got, but what you gave. What will matter is not your success, but your significance. What will matter is not what you learned, but what you taught. What will matter is every act of integrity, compassion, courage, and sacrifice that enriched, empowered, and encouraged others to emulate your example. What will matter is not your competence, but your character. What will matter is not how many people you knew, but how many will feel a lasting loss when you are gone. What will matter is not your memories, but the memories that live in those who loved you. What will matter is how long you will be remembered, by whom and for what. Living a life that matters doesn't happen by accident. It's not a matter of circumstance, but of choice. Choose a life that matters. And if that doesn't reflect and summarize the life that we are celebrating here today, then I don't know. But when I read that poem, this man, Dr. Beyers Naudé, just stood in front of me and said, I have lived a life that matters. So today, colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce to you our guest speaker, Professor Malisela John Lamula, who is an associate professor of the philosophy of technology at the University of Johannesburg's Institute for Intelligent Systems and the founding chairperson of the research group on Africa, philosophy, and digital technologies. If you want to check that up, it's www.apdit.africa. Professor Lamula obtained his PhD from Edinburgh University and an MBA from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University at Daytona Beach, USA. He started his career with a UNISA theology degree and worked at the South African Council of Churches and the Institute for Contextual Theology in the mid-80s. Reflecting this stage of his career, he recently published a book titled Sowing in Tears, a documentary history of the church's struggle against apartheid, 1960 to 1990. Besides his frequent public engagements on contemporary South African politics, Prof. Lamula's research interests are on the intersection between social philosophy in the context of emergence of African modernity and the philosophy of science and technology. He publishes in international scholarly journals on African philosophy, Karl Marx's epistemology, Jean-Paul Sartre's existential anti-colonial philosophy, and on the participation of Africa in the technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He is a professional member of the Society on Social Implications of Technology of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, help me welcome Prof. Lamula to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Master of Ceremonies, Madam Professor Mtose, Vice Chancellor of the University of Zululand, Ms. Ntsaba, the Chairperson of Kagiso Trust, and the members of the Kagiso Trust Board that are gathered here with us today, the CEO, Ms. Muitse, the Nodie family represented by Mr. Johan and Ms. Rita Nodie, the students of the University of Zululand, and all and honored guests. The technical title of our lecture is Beyers Nodie, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the Renewal of the Self, being born again into the struggle for a non-racial, just and prosperous South Africa. The question of being, to be or not to be, is one of the most important subjects in philosophy. Engagement with this question sometimes is referred to as a study of ontology. In reference to the state of the human being, we talk of human ontology, and in reference to the state of society, we talk of social ontology. It was seminally taken up, this question, by German philosopher Friedrich Hegel during the 18th century, and later by Martin Heidegger in the 1930s. It was, however, dramatically contextualized into our times by Sartre as a practical political inquiry on human existence. I will, in this lecture, take the life of being Beyers Nodie as a challenge at the way in which we as South Africans conceive of ourselves, our being as humans. For Africa, this inquiry on being has specifically always been an enterprise on contesting of our being human, following the ravages on our sense of being by the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid. Consequent to this, African philosophers have set themselves the task of formulating standards of evaluating the quality of our humanity. For instance, on the question of what essentially qualifies our species, Homo sapiens, to be called human, they have concluded that it is the attainment of Ubuntu, Botho, as the possession and display of a particular quality of communally judged mentality. We will not dwell into discerning the state of the self of our nation. And instead, we will focus on Beyers Nodie and reflect on how he conducted his self as a typology of the challenge that rises before us as individuals within the historical and political context of our times. The latter times of Nodie's life, in particular the period from around 1963 following the Sharpeville massacre of March 1960, and the events leading to and following the Rivonia trial of 1964, up to 1994, that those times were characterized by a peculiar vision of what it means to be a responsible umuntu in a racist and troubled land. Those times posed the question, how to be an authentic person? How was one to account for one's racial identity and class positionality in a society which made those vectors, race and class, markers of a destiny as either a participant in the struggle with the victims of apartheid or a collaborator wallowing in the privileges so abominably provided by the regime. The choices made by Nodier and his conscientious compatriots, black and white, ensures that we can now look back at this time as a time of selflessness. What do we mean when we use words like this? How does self-aware human beings become selfless? And there is no other answer within the context of our historical political context than the words that rang through a court in 1964. I quote, "I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." There can be no philosophical definition of selflessness than those words of Nelson Mandela. Their human ontology, the Mandelas and the people of the times of Nodier, their sense of being human was being in struggle against colonialism, racism, sexism, and a myriad injustices that had institutionalized the impoverishment of generations of the black majority. They were not simply against apartheid because apartheid was evil. They had fundamentally subscribed to a sense of being, or found a set of beliefs that drove them to find their anti-black and capitalistic dehumanization in Verwoerd's philosophy unacceptable and intolerable. Set against this ontology that drove the struggle against the apartheid system, the current state of South African society is not only alarming, but embarrassing. As indicated, unfortunately, I will in this lecture not devote time dwelling on the ills of the state of our nation. Thieving politicians and looting public servants, poverty growing alarmingly out of hand, emergence of tribalism and racism in our politics, sexism and its concomitant gender-based violence, and on the other hand, the invigoration of self-centered greed and callousness among those who have previously benefited from the apartheid regime. This status quo challenges us, I contend this morning, to re-evaluate our ontology, our sense of being, the kind of persons that we are in the time and place where we are right now. This status quo calls for the renewal of our moral and political commitments. To avoid sermonizing, let me hinge my references to the renewal of the self, to the thought system of Jean-Paul Sartre. By the self, he and I mean our sense of who we are, which is the way we exist. Sartre systematized the philosophical doctrine that held that this self-consciousness, our consciousness, our being, is actually within the control of the human person, the subject. Meaning that our consciousness, what we are in our existence, is not something that is out there, it's something that is in our hands. we have the freedom and ability to remake ourselves. This freedom for self-creation, of projecting ourselves over and against the constraints within which we are born, is, according to Sartre, what constitutes our human being. We cannot blame our conduct on heredity or history, nor on environmental and psychological influences. Man's destiny lies with himself, the French philosopher will remind. Tied to the idea of being human being. By the way, whoever in the English language decided that we, this species, is called human being, I don't think realize what they meant, because you are not just. To be a human being is an attainment. Human being, within human being, there is a notion of becoming. And hence, in the African philosophical discovery of Ubuntu, there's such wealth. There are people who are not batho, kasisotho, not everyone ke motho. When we say, indeed, lo muntu ngumuntu, there are particular qualities, there's an attainment. This person has become something. Sartre says, we are at every moment, the choices we make, we are responsible for what okuba umuntu is our responsibility, and it lies in our hands. The challenge here is that at all times to be critically conscious of the situation in which one is, and to projectively make oneself within that situation. This is what in the 1970s was understood as being conscientized. Being conscientized, this self-making into a new state of consciousness is similar to rebirth. In the philosophy of Bantu Steve Biko, non-whites were reborn into blacks. Non-whites were called Indians, Coloreds, Bantu, natives, plurals, decided to remake themselves into simply blacks. They attained a realization of their being as self-dependent and self-defining beings. Hence, our concluding statement will be that we have a challenge to be reborn, from being collaborators in the despoliation of the rights of the poor in post-apartheid South Africa to being champions of freedom and justice. And by the way, Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy and life praxis as a Frenchman who in the late 1950s defied his French racial and national state of being and sided with the Algerian struggle against French colonization, informed much of the tenets of the Black consciousness movement. Biko and his cohort read Sartre. Sartre, the citizen of La République Française, who remade himself into Frantz Fanon's comrade. He wrote a preface to Fanon's famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, in which he justifies the revolutionary violence of the FNLA, the Algerian Liberation Movement, against Sartre, against his own fatherland and folk. Sartre's life is a drama of the self standing in opposition to and purposefully transcending the imposing collective social ontology and historical structures of its time. Apartheid manifested as a racist and brutal Afrikaner nationalism. Similarly, the manner in which Beyers Naudé crafted himself into a valiant opponent of apartheid against the weight of his own racial and ethnic identity presents itself to us as inspiration and an object of study. Christian Frederick Beyers Naudé was a descendant of the French Huguenots who arrived in the Cape in 1712. He was a white settler, a beneficiary of colonialism. He was an Afrikaner, dominee of the Nederduitse Gereformeerde Kerk, who between the years 1940 and 1963 was a member of the Boerderbond. Yet, or rather paradoxically, on this day, 19th October, in the year 1977, when the Vorster regime decided to silence all organizations, publications, and persons who were symbols of the expression of Black protest during those gloomy weeks following the murder of Steve Biko, Beyers Naudé and his Christian Institute were on Jimmy Kruger's list. At some point, Jessie Juwate, the current Deputy General Secretary of the ANC, was Naudé's personal secretary, as a consequence of which she endured a torturous spell of detention for this association with Naudé. Indications abound that Naudé was an active operative of the ANC underground structures from around 1977. Legend has it that he was involved in the doomed mission of the meeting between Oliver Tambo and Steve Biko during the weeks before Biko was captured and killed in police detention. Upon Naudé's death and state funeral on the 18th September 2004, in compliance with his testamentary wishes, he rejected the traditional Afrikaans Christian funeral. He was cremated, and some of his ashes were scattered around Alexandra Township, Johannesburg. From being deemed a worthy recruit into the secretive Boerderbond at the age of 25, to a human being who through his actions conflated, confabulated, and reconstructed the meaning of being an Afrikaner in South Africa. From one born and nurtured by a church that provided the sophistry that justified the alleged natural inferiority of the humanity of so-called non-Europeans, becoming not only a dominee in this NG Kerk, but attaining the status of a moderator to a humane pastor to all who suffered under apartheid. How did this radical transformation occur? Sartre, in his 1937 text titled The Transcendence of the Ego, refers to this radical transformation of consciousness, this recalibration of oneself and place in history as a transcendence. He explicated that human existence is about continual transcendence of what we all naturally find ourselves thrown into at birth: our racial identity, family history, circumstances, and country of birth. Another writer in the book of Romans talks about this transformation in different ways, saying it is a renewal of the mind. And this writer says, do not conform to the standards of this world, but be ye renewed by the transformation of your minds. It is a renewal that sets one to being into a state of refusal to be consumed by the dominant narratives of the day. And where this choice, or where this transformation and transcendence happens simply by the choices that one takes. And therefore, of some interest to us today is how, though scientifically, leaving the religious part aside, or if you like philosophically, did Naudé manage to transcend his natural ontology, his whiteness, and become one of the heroes of the struggle of Black liberation? How did Dominee Naudé become Umbey to all of us? In 1949, the 34-year-old Naudé moved to the epicenter of Afrikaner political intellectual leadership as he assumed the position of assistant minister to Ben Marais at the Pretoria East NG Kerk congregation. A few months before that, during 1948, the Nationalist Party under the leadership of a former NG Dominee, D.F. Malan had taken over power with a manifesto promising apartheid to the white electorate. A year earlier, that is in 1947, the Afrikaner Broederbond had established the South African Bureau of Racial Affairs just to oppose the SA Institute of Race Relations. If you can imagine today, if we have the Institute of Race Relations led by Ms. Zille, and that in 1947, someone felt that they needed an organization to oppose the South African Institute of Race Relations. You can imagine what this South African Bureau of Racial Relations was. Yeah. A systematic racism that denies the humanity of blacks was rationalized by the SABRA into a functional social system, later packaged by Hendrik Verwoerd as a political theory named separate development. It was preached that without separation along racial lines, the quote European race will be swamped by majority quote non-European races. As a youthful member of the Broederbond based in Pretoria, Naudé will certainly have invested his intellectual energy in these developments. Propitiously, however, it was exactly at this point that the moment of a transformative anguish will set in motion. His co-minister, Dominique Ben Marais, had already begun to interrogate the NG Kerk's justification of apartheid on scriptural grounds. In 1952, Marais had published a book titled Die Kleer Crisis and Die Weste, The Crisis of Color in the West. Although the current official website of the University of Stellenbosch, which claims Naudé as his alumnus, maintains that he was influenced by the thinking of a theologian, B.B. Kiet, during his studies at Stellenbosch Seminary, it can be averred that it was Ben Marais who directly encouraged Naudé to read the Bible differently, thereby launching him into a path of spiritual turmoil and awakening. Between 1955 and 1959, Naudé served his church from Potchefstroom. In the 1957 International Reformed Ecumenical Synod convened in that town. Every 10 years, all the Reformed churches of the world get together. In 1957, coincidentally, they met at the town where Naudé had to be the responsible host. In preparation for this gathering of the global reform churches, the NG Kerk in 1956, the year before, had preemptively released its categorical promotion of white supremacy in a booklet entitled The Judge Reformed Churches in South Africa and the Problems of Race Relations. This statement held inter alia that, quote, it was the will of God that in the foreseeable future, white civilization should be maintained in South Africa, and that this can only be done by securing white supremacy, quite quote closed. Going against the South African NG Kerk, the Synod raised critical questions on apartheid, further opening Naudé's eyes to the theological bankruptcy and ethical defects of apartheid. This gradually set him into a path of dissidence against not only the political conduct of his church as the provider of the philosophical basis of apartheid, but on the meaning of his identity as a white Afrikaner, which identity was used to exploit and dominate and oppress others. From Potchefstroom, ultimately, it was the news and reflections of the events at Sharpeville in March 1960 that were to serve as a decision point for Naudé. 69 black bodies and more than 200 injured with bullet wounds from a single township for peacefully protesting against the enforcement of Verwoerd separate development. In the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre, the World Council of Churches convened a crisis conference with its affiliated denominations in South Africa. Naudé became one of the principal delegates of the NG Kerk to this conference, which was held in Kotersloh, Johannesburg, in December 1960. The conference emerged with a statement criticizing the apartheid regime. In response, Prime Minister Verwoerd issued an order, can you imagine, that members of the NG Kerk delegation distance themselves from the conference decision. The entire delegation, with the exception of Nodier, complied with Verwoerd's order. From that moment on, Nodier's position within the National Party, the Boerderbond, and the NG Kerk became untenable. He immediately launched a journal named Pro Veritate. Pro Veritate from Latin means standing for the truth. The first issue of which appeared on the 15th of May, 1962. And immediately a year later, 1963, he became the founding director of the Christian Institute. The CI, Christian Institute, was organized as a movement of small groups meetings who were coordinated to critically rethink the meaning of being a Christian in apartheid South Africa. Up to this time, since the Cottesloe Conference, Nodier appeared to have believed and hoped that he could convince the Afrikaner intellectual and political leadership of the indefensibility of apartheid. The launch of the CI marked the turning point of no return. He resigned from the Boerderbond, and on Sunday, the 3rd of November, 1963, gave his farewell sermon to the Aasvoel congregation, Northcliffe, Johannesburg, and resigned as a minister of the NG Kerk. In the absence of the South African Council of Churches, that was to be founded only in 1968, and in the void of organized Black political protest following the massively successful repression that was unleashed following the banning of the people's organizations in 1960. The CI emerged as the only thorn that was growing on the side of the apartheid regime. In October 1966, the General Synod of the NG Kerk declared that the Christian Institute, the CI, was an un-Christian organization and ordered all NG Kerk members to withdraw their membership and support from its activities. Because of its criticism of apartheid, the Synod declared it had fallen into communism. The pervasive religious conviction that the policies of the apartheid regime had some divine support and that critics of the state were agents of atheistic and anti-religious communism gradually hardened and sharpened the attitude of the government towards so-called white liberals. Starting around the early 1970s, the kind of repressive state brutality that had routinely been reserved for Blacks and supporters of the South African Communist Party began to feature in the regime's attempts to silence any white person who broke ranks with a privileged white lager. In October 1968, Prime Minister John Vorster, successor to Verwoerd, initiated a propaganda campaign against Code, who under the cloak of religion want to disturb order in South Africa, Code closed, and Code, who are binding about the idea that they should do the sort of thing here in South Africa, which Martin Luther King did in America, Code closed. In a speech headlined in the Cape Times newspaper of the 28th of October of that year, he sternly warned the Christian Institute members, and I quote, cut it out immediately, because the cloth you are wearing will not protect you. If you try to do this in South Africa, quote closed. By this time, it was too late. Beyers Nodier was a new being. He will not be threatened by Vorster. He had been born into the struggle for a non-racial, just and prosperous South Africa. The same year, Nodier's movement had achieved a double milestone victory. A council of churches that was proposed at Cottesloe in 1960 was eventually launched in 1968 as a South African Council of Churches. At the same time, which in part provoked Vorster's alarm, the SACC released a widely publicized booklet called A Message to the People of South Africa. Against the regime's church, the message declared, quote, we believe that this doctrine of separation is false faith and novel gospel. it inevitably is in conflict with the gospel of Jesus Christ, quote closed. Apartheid theology was declared a fake gospel. Putting word into action, SICC and the CI proceeded to institute a mass mobilizing national, what they call study project on Christianity in apartheid South Africa. From this point on, ladies and gentlemen, it is crucial to note how Nodier's rebirth also affected the rebirth of ecumenical Christianity in South Africa. He instantiated and animated the church struggle against apartheid from 1960 right to 1994. Throughout the 1960s, the South African history of religious political protest was to be dominated by the bravery and humanity of Beyers Naudé, just it was dominated in the 1950s by Father Trevor Huddleston. The difference between Huddleston and Naudé, and one of immense historical significance to note, is that whereas Huddleston worked with the liberation movement outside of the Anglican Church, Naudé decidedly worked with the church and sought to make the entire church in South Africa, Afrikaans, English, and African independent churches, aware of the need to oppose apartheid. And further on, in 1967, the Christian Institute organized a series of provincial conferences on the church and race relations in South Africa. And dramatically, on the night of the 31st of October, 1967, during one of these meetings, the Western Cape group of Christians, led by a priest at Woodstock, who was one of the CI activists, organized a march to St. George's Cathedral, the seat of the Anglican Archbishop, and nailed a document of 95 theses. Martin Luther, and 1521 did the same, on the main door of the cathedral. Although this thesis referred directly, the theses were criticizing and talking and exposing about racism in the churches. Although this thesis referred directly only to racism within the Anglican Church, the symbolism and the drama of this act challenged the entire Christian ecumenical movement in the country. It forced the church to realize that while it was castigating the apartheid regime for its racist policies, it was itself an institution infested with racism. Naudé pushed the paradigm from stop criticizing the Boere church and realize that you also, the English-speaking churches, you still have segregated pews. The time around this 1968, though, was important because it was to signal the second stage of Naudé's rebirth or self-remaking, namely his interlocution with proponents of the rising Black consciousness movement. Naudé thrived within the controversy generated by the movement's denunciation of leadership of the anti-apartheid struggle by white liberals such as him. In addition, the CI had to contend with the Black conscious BCM's opposition to multiracial alliances in anti-apartheid initiatives, as well as its rejection of the concept of racial integration based on the then dominant paradigm of the normalization of race relations. In May 1971, Naudé was invited by the University of Natal Student Representative Council to deliver the Edgar Brooke annual lecture. His chosen subject was Black anger and white power in unreal society. At a time when many white liberals were alarmed by the radical Black assertion of the Black consciousness movement, Naudé launched into a rigorous and passionate account on Black power and the implications it will have on the future of South Africa. After that study program on the future of apartheid in South Africa that was launched in 1969, the leadership of SASO, South African Student Organization, led by Biko, engaged Naudé. They pointed to the interim reports of Prosperous as evidence of the paternalism of white liberals attempting to analyze South Africa and to propose solutions to his problems without any meaningful consultations with Black people. This criticism was articulated by Biko in his editorial introduction to a Sprocast publication. Sprocast, no dear them, started for a publication called Black Viewpoint. In that editorial, Biko wrote, quote, "So many things are said so often to us and for us, but very seldom by us," quote closed. The ensuing dialogue between the CI and the leadership of the Black Consciousness Movement led to the relaunching of this whole entire program as it was started in 1968. It was renamed from the study project to a special program on Christianity and Apartheid South Africa. And it had two partially separated wings, one called Black community programs and one white community programs. The white community programs just fizzled out of existence, and the Black community programs grew into a significantly successful Black community development and self-reliance organization, presaging the Kagiso Trust of today. Throughout his life, Naudé displayed and epitomized a sophisticated appreciation and support of the Black Consciousness Movement. He was willing to learn from Black people. In a similar trait, when he decided to reassume his position of church minister after he resigned in 1963, he subjected himself in 1980 to the leadership of Reverend Sam Booty, becoming the minister of the Black Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, Alexandra Township congregation. When in 1970, the World Council of Churches Special Fund program to combat racism made financial grants to the South African liberation movements, including the ANC and the PAC, cathartic controversy erupted among the mainly white-led churches. Was it correct for the church to support the armed struggle? Naudé again stood out as the voice of reason and empathy during that debate, which raged into the SACC's 1974 annual conference. At that conference, together with Douglas Bax, Naudé piloted the monumental resolution around the fact that young white Christians were encouraged to take part in the government's compulsory military conscription rule, whilst service in the liberation forces was considered as terrorist activity. The resolution passed by the SACC, penned by Naudé and Bax, embraced the just war theory that went back to reminding the white congregation that was worried about the World Council of Churches supporting the liberation movements of how the First and the Second Anglo-Boer War took place. Quote, they wrote into that resolution. The injustice and oppression under which the Black people of South Africa labor is far worse than that against which Afrikaners waged their first and second wars of independence. And that if we justify the Afrikaners' resort to violence, or the violence of the imperialism of the English, or claim that God was on their side, it is hypocritical to deny that the same applies to the blacks, to deny that the same applies to the blacks, to the Black people in their struggle today, stated the resolution. Fast forward to 12 years later, as the General Secretary of the SACC, he engineered the Lusaka 1987 conference between national liberation organizations and the church leaders, at which an unequivocal declaration was made that the South African government was illegitimate, and thus the means adopted by the organizations of the oppressed to curb its tyrannical rule were to be supported by the church at large. Naudé succeeded Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Laureate, as the General Secretary of the SACC in August 1985. But his being was different. His life journey, mission, and modus operandi, or modus vivendi, was unique. The sincerity of his choice to side with the oppressed was repeatedly tested by incessant persecution from the authorities. In 1972, his passport was withdrawn. In 1973, the Slebush Commission was established by the Foster regime to deal with his association with the Black consciousness movement. His defiance against cooperating with the commission earned him a cold night in a jail cell after a fine was paid unbeknown to him. On 19th October 1977, when the CI was banned together with all the BCM organizations, he was placed under house arrest for 5 years, which in 1982 was extended for a further 2 years. It was therefore poignantly ironic that when in May 1990, the ANC puts its delegation for the first formal and public meeting with the apartheid government at Groote, Nelson Mandela had to have Beyers Naudé in the ANC delegation to face the Afrikaner colleagues he had worked from in 1963. Towards our conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I've here refrained from appreciating Naudé as a rebel Afrikaner who became a victim and overcame the brutality of the Foster regime and heroically endured the attacks of being a heretic, a communist, and kafir by the church he grew up in. Contra this portrait, Naudé is availed to us as a self-creating being who sought and attained authenticity within the milieu of apartheid South Africa. He never denied that he was an Afrikaner. He authentically found his mission in life within the contradictions of his identity. I assert that the self-mutation that Naudé underwent coalesced theoretically with what is postulated by Sartre's existentialism on the capacity of the human self to be intentionally repositioned by a conscious being. Accordingly, in Naudé's ontology and praxis, we are offered a template to refashion our consciousness in the midst of the South Africa of 2021. To the Black masses, the message of a self that transcends all its structural and historical constraints is that we cannot imprison ourselves into the past forever. We cannot forever live in a consciousness of constantly reminding us of what Bantu education and all of apartheid has done to us. We need to find light in our dimly lit present situation. Let us remake and reposition ourselves as responsible, liberated people. White South Africans must search for lessons from Naudé's ability to choose for himself the kind of a person he became, despite the strong cultural and political ideologies within which he was embedded as a member of the Afrikaans white community. As South Africans in general, we cannot allow our racial, tribal, and ethnic identities to define for us the meaning of being human and how we view and relate with each other. These natural attributes, according to Sartre and as demonstrated in the life of Naudé, race, tribe, etc., can be transcended. And in our conflict-ridden society, they have to be transcended. We have to and can remake ourselves, be reborn into builders of a truly non-racial, equitable, and caring society. All that we have to do is to choose to do so. We are the choices we make. Those among us who boast a life of history in the past struggle against apartheid are challenged that we cannot remain captivated by a mentality that forever says, I have suffered in struggle, I was in jail, I was in exile. Such state of consciousness has bred a culture of political elitism and an entitlement to loot state coffers with impunity. To those, the conclusion of our analysis says that we need to be reconscientized, to be born again into a people who feel and act in passion as it was in the 1970s. Let us stop quoting Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo in the day, while at night we are stealing and conniving with the enemies of the common good of the people of South Africa. Remake yourself, be born again. The salvation of South Africa does not lie in the renewal of some political party or the reconstitution of our body politic. It lies with the renewal of the individual selves, with the transformation of the inner self of the kind Nodie underwent when he abandoned his National Party folk in 1961-63 and interacted with Biko from 1971. A new South Africa is yearning to be born. Thank you.
Well, the lecture delivered by Professor Lamula, and looking at the subject for this lecture, I'm sure we can all have different interpretations, but we can appreciate that the detail with which you took us through was a journey that I'm sure all of us will be calling for in order for us to hit the call. Copies of that lecture will need to be distributed, Prof. Thank you very much. From the moment you outlined how as a society we can strive towards being selfless, again, how to be renewed, and our society today being ridden in conflict, you also gave us homework. Thank you very much. Again, I think Professor Lamula deserves another round of applause. Well, earlier on, before the introduction by Professor Ntombela, we attempted to play you the video that was going to give us a brief understanding and entry into Ombe's life. So I'm sure it is ready now before we move into the respondents and then take your contributions to the lecture.
The South African cleric and activist Beyers Naudé was one of the most important white voices opposed to South Africa's exclusionary system known as apartheid. Naudé came to believe that Christian beliefs could not be reconciled with a racist system, which discriminated against Black South Africans. After leaving the Dutch Reformed Church in which he was raised and ordained a minister, Naudé formed the Christian Institute of Southern Africa. Bey, as he was affectionately known, was born on the 10th of May 1915 in Gauteng and passed on the 7th of September 2004. As an anti-apartheid stalwart, the 19th of October marks the anniversary of Beyers Naudé's banning. This is also the day that Kagiso Trust celebrates the spirit and ethos of this giant.
Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have heard from the lecture delivered by Professor Lamula. So we will be taking questions both on the Zoom platform as well as here. We will identify hands all at once, questions, your viewpoint, and then we will have the respondents as well. But for now, it gives me great pleasure then to invite Ms. Tissa Dooms, and she is the director of Jesuro Consulting, which is a newly established development consultancy, and it provides organizations with services on policy, programming, and strategies towards the development of our continent. And she also does political analysis, sometimes economical as well. And Tissa has 15 years experience as a development worker, trainer, researcher, as well as an activist on matters of governance and social justice. And in 2015, we all recall when she was announced, I think she was announced as the youngest appointee to serve in the National Planning Commission, advising the president on the implementation of the National Development Plan. And I see she's active on social networks as well. She's been tweeting, retweeting, liking on the lecture today. So let me invite her then to give us a respondent to respond to what the professor had delivered on behalf of the trust. Ms. Dooms, please.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm here today really in my capacity as a board member for the Kagiso Trust, and just want to reiterate how grateful we are for the participation of everybody here today, the partnership with UniZulu, and the opportunity to memorialize one of our ancestors in our organization. Since we've been talking this morning a lot about ontologies, Professor John Mbiti, an African philosopher and theologian, speaks about African ontologies and the ability of African people to provide immortality to each other through the act of memory. And the ways in which we understand memory is that we keep people alive through our ability to remember them. That when people pass, the only ways in which they remain alive is through our invocation of them. And so these things are important, these moments are important of memorializing, not only because it helps us remember what that person meant and did and how that person may have inspired, but it also helps that person remain alive forever because those who come after them continue to invoke their name. And that's what we're doing today. We're keeping alive not only a person in the form of Beyers Naudé, but everything that that person stood for remains active in our society as we remember. And so today, as I respond, I want to thank Prophet Lamola. I've been saying it for 2 days and now I say it wrong now. Because I think it was such an important way to segue into this conversation to talk about being. Somebody once asked me the question, are you a human being or a human doing? And the idea was that sometimes we are so focused on the doing that we forget to ask ourselves who we are when we are not doing. You know, who are we at our core? And I believe that this was not only a lecture that was asking us as individuals, who are we and who are we going to be? But it was asking us as a collective called South Africa, who are we going to be? I believe that South Africa from this lecture can ask two important questions. The first is, who are we going to be as a society? Who are we and who are we going to be? And the second is, what are we going to do to become who we need to be? And unless we answer those questions, we will not move forward as a society. We will move, but much like a hamster on a wheel, our movement will take us nowhere until we answer those two questions. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that in our efforts to build a nation, we have in some ways defaulted to this idea that building a nation is about rainbows and fairy tales and unicorns and nice things. But the efforts of building a nation requires some work, and that work is about deep reflection, and that work is about accountability and reflecting together. And I want to put to you two ideas. One is that what we need as a country is to ask ourselves questions of personhood. Do we see each other in the society? When we talk about that word Sawubona, that idea of seeing each other, are we seeing each other? And the second question is, do we have purpose? So questions of personhood and questions of purpose. So let's go to the question of personhood first. In July, when we had the riots that swept through parts of our country, I found myself sitting in my home in the northern suburbs of Joburg, in my little apartment and feeling a sense of disjuncture, a sense of being very disturbed at my positionality at that moment. Because there I was sitting in my flat, watching on television scenes that looked like a country that I wasn't in, even though that country was 10 minutes away from my door. And for 2 weeks, I could sit in the comfort of my home and watch those scenes play out as if I was not a part of them. And it made me think about and listening to the conversations we were having on social media and amongst people of my same economic peer group. The words that I started hearing made me realize that we are not seeing each other in this country. Words like, what are they doing? Words like, this is not us. And my least favorite word, the word that really broke me every time I heard it, was the reference to people who were participating in those riots as the looters. What we had done in that moment is we had reduced people to that singular act that we were watching and stripped them of their personhood and their humanity. Stripped them of being more than just people who were participating in a riot. Those people are us. They are our fellow countrymen. They are people who we have to have a shared destiny with. They are people who are mothers, they are fathers, they are sisters, they are workers. They're so much more than the looters. But it made me realize that we've become so comfortable in the society of ours, of just reducing each other to tags and labels, because we've not shaken off the inhumanity of our history. A friend of mine named Loveland Nwade said in 2016, as a Fees Must Fall activist talking in Stellenbosch, her alma mater, at Convocation. She said that what we don't realize is that even in this day, apartheid has stripped all South Africans of our humanity. It stripped white South Africans of their humanity as collaborators in the way that Prof. Lamola spoke about it, collaborators in dehumanizing others, and it stripped Black people of their humanity as victims of that dehumanization. But it doesn't seem that we've recovered from that dehumanization that crime against humanity brought upon us. And so the idea that we need to reflect and ask ourselves who we are is an important one, because without that, we cannot see others and we cannot see each other. One of the greatest tools that the apartheid government used was the ability to keep people away from each other so they could not see. Keep white people in a little enclave so they could not see what their privilege meant for Black people's humanity. Keep Black people away from white people so they cannot see what their humanity, the indignity they were facing was giving and contributing to somebody else. But we still live in that South Africa today. We still live in enclaves. We still live in ways that we can dismiss and not see each other. And so when those July riots happened, part of our discontent was the fact that we had to see. We were forced to see what indignity and poverty does. We were forced to see that there's a different South Africa than the one that you get to comfortably live if you are in certain parts of our society. If we weren't upset about buildings burning, we were upset that our peace was disturbed because we were forced to see each other. And so I use this moment for us to think about what that means. How often are we going outside of what is comfortable for us and truly being willing to see what the rest of our country has to live through and deal with and what its consequences are? In a conversation with my Kagiso Trust chairperson, Mandela, a few days ago, we were talking about the UDF, and I've decided to become a student of the UDF. I was born in 1984, so I was a toddler. I didn't know what was going on. And I asked her to explain to me how, in the context that they were in, the UDF was able to inspire and organize and have street committees, and there was no social media, there was no ways in which people could connect. How did they manage in that context to have a force that could overthrow the apartheid government? And her answer was simple. Her answer was, we had one common enemy. Her answer was purpose. There was a shared purpose that galvanized us, whether we knew each other or not, whether we could see each other or not. And we sat and we thought, what would be the common purpose that might draw together South Africans today for a UDF type moment? And it's easy, especially during the election season as we are in now, to think that the answer is the ANC or some other political party or some grouping or some person. But if we reduce our sense of purpose and struggle to a party or a person, we're missing the opportunity to dig deep to things that matter to people intrinsically. On the inside, we talk about the July riots as if they were a response to what happened to Jacob Zuma. I assure you, the lady who was stealing Pampers was not motivated in her heart by Jacob Zuma being in Escort prison. There was a desire to overcome something else that motivated that participation. And we must find what that is. We must determine a common purpose. We must have a vision that draws us together and gives us something that we can all care about. For some people, like with the Kagiso Trust, it's overcoming poverty. For other people, it's about violence and ending that in our society. If you ask me what I think the cry call should be and what should gather us together, it should be ending inequality. Because without a common purpose that is not just about me as an individual, we will never become a nation that goes somewhere together. So why do I say inequality should be part of our purpose? Because if you think about why inequality continues, a lot of it is about the fact that we allow business practices that are about my profits, what I'm going to do with my business, even if it's at the expense of workers who are my countrymen having a decent life. Why should it matter if I am a corrupt politician? I'm thinking about my own ends. I'm thinking about my own enrichment. My purpose is myself. And I don't understand that the fate of other people is connected to my own. And so I believe that we need to start talking about that. We need to start talking about the fact that our fates are connected, that the injustices that other people experience, if we take that Martin Luther quote that was spoken so eloquently earlier, that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. That sense may give us a way to start saying, it's not enough that I win if it comes at the expense of somebody who my destiny is tied to losing. I'm a youth development worker by trade. It's the thing I've done the most in my life. And last night we were having a conversation about what's going wrong with young people in the country. And my answer to this is a simple one, is that if youth is a transition from being a child to being an adult, a transition has a beginning point, but it must also have an end point. It must have a goal. It must have a purpose. And youth development work in this country has stagnated because we don't have a purpose. We are all developing young people, but we have no idea what we are developing them to be. And the reason why we don't know where we want young people to be is because we don't know where we want South Africa to be. We cannot ask young people to become when we have not decided who we are going to be. Become what? Become who? What does it mean to be a thriving South African person? And where are young people meant to go? We may not get it right all the time to build the right structures, but at least let's build the right sense of purpose so that people have somewhere that becomes the North Star to which they can become. Because without personhood and purpose, we are going to continue being aimless wanderers, passing each other by. We are going to continue to be people who don't see each other's humanity and violate each other. We're going to continue to be people who enrich ourselves at the expense of others. And so as much as it's a question of the individual, it is a question of the collective. We have to get ourselves together and start asking that question. And how do we ask that question? And this will be my parting shot. Frantz Fanon has been mentioned today. And one of the quotes that Frantz Fanon has given us is the one that says, every generation must start of relative obscurity, find its mission, fulfill it or betray it. And usually when I speak on this and when many people speak on this quote, they are talking about young people. And it's a way to mobilize young people to find their purpose and for their generation. But I'd like to extend this to all of us as South Africans. That every generation of South Africans alive right now, whatever generation you fit into, needs to find its purpose, fulfill it or betray it. And that's not just the generation of young people we have now. It's the generation of white people we have now. This generation of white people needs to find its purpose, fulfill it and betray it. Ask, what are we going to contribute towards the making of the South Africa? Black middle-class people, this generation of Black middle-class people must find their purpose, fulfill it and betray it. Ask, what am I going to contribute to the making of the South Africa? Young business people in townships and rural areas, that generation of young business people that are now here must ask, what are we going to contribute to South Africa? What is going to be our mission for this generation? Fulfill it or betray it. Political elites of this day and age, this generation of political elites must ask that question. What is our mission? Are we going to fulfill it or are we going to betray it? While we just sit around and point at each other and say what you are going to do, we are missing out on the opportunity of getting anything done. Part of our political culture that's broken is there's so much finger pointing happening right now. So much finger pointing. And I want to encourage us to, before we point out to others, that we ask ourselves, what is my generational mission right now? Will I fulfill it or will I betray it? And that's my hope, that we all get to the point where we can answer that question and build the South Africa we want. Thank you.
That was Ms. Dooms from Kagiso Trust, giving us a response to the lecture and the theme that we are about today. Thank you very much. I think it's befitting now that we get also a response coming from the university. The next speaker who's going to respond on behalf of University of Zululand is the Dean of Faculty of Arts. And his speciality is in research and in indigenous research and decoloniality that spans an experience of 25 years. And he has managed to develop Afro-sensed approaches and frames, conducting researches with local communities. The prevailing question that if you have a university or an academic institution, how does it benefit with the communities in which it is located. So Professor Mahome Alpheus Masocha specializes in that field, and he is responding on behalf of the university. Over to you, Prof.
My hands. Tessa challenged me a little bit, because she became a little bit informal, and not doing the usual rituals of saying Vice Chancellor and Principal of the university, but I'm very traditional. Maybe let me follow that, unless I face a challenge after this lecture. I'm called to the Vice Chancellor's office to say you have not done it the proper way. Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Mtose, and the council members of this university who have joined virtually, the Kagiso Trust chairperson and the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honored, and I must say it was very difficult because I've been pushing Professor Lamula to get his presentation, though we got it a little bit late, but I'm not going to spill all the beans, but I think ultimately I was able to get it, Prof. And I want to thank you for this lecture. A very august lecture, very befitting, an important lecture. I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to do this task, to honor this great thinker, this great personality, humanitarian, an exemplary person in so many ways. Professor Lamula provides a rich account of Nodier's life and a role of anti-apartheid struggle to highlight how Nodier remakes himself in opposition to the dominant racist template of his immediate native Afrikaner community. This, according to Professor Lamula, is in line with what is postulated by Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism, and he therefore calls upon us to emulate Nodier and Sartre and activate our capacity to be, and I quote him, intentionally repositioned by the conscious being, a close quote. But I have a little bit of a challenge, but in focusing rather exclusively, Prof, on the personal and individual dimensions of human ontology and being. This call runs the risk of doing precisely what it promised not to do. And that's my take for you from your lecture. It ought not to end up in line with the, and I want to quote here, charismatic calls, and this is from your paper, for national moral regeneration, becoming largely or merely as sermonizing as you had it in your paper. Remake yourself, be born again. Need to be accompanied by some programmatic or methodical elucidation, of which you partly touched on it. Furthermore, I think we need to avoid the danger of the overwhelming focus on an ontology of the self, almost to the total exclusion of the collective political and historical structures, falling into the trap of reducing complex sociological, political phenomena into what may be taken, rightly or wrongly so, as simplistic, moralistic sound bites. On the basis of this, I wish to offer what I call my pinch of salt, in addition to the songs we sing for Nodier today, and how his legacy can spur us to making our own contributions towards a better South Africa today. There are certain men and women who are given to humanity to serve as flames or igniters of new ways of being, to initiate new patterns of activism in society. In Greek mythology, which you know, Prof, we are told of a man called Prometheus, who upon being seized by compassion for humans who were not so naturally favored, stole fire from the gods and gave to humanity. He suffered the consequences of that noble rebellion that wise betrayal. There are many men and women in our country who, over the course of time, have borne the torch of bravery, revolution, reform, and freedom. Great personalities like Steve Biko, you mentioned him, and Nelson Mandela, and a brave figure, Solomon Mahlangu, whose love for his people and humanity saw him hang to his death for freedom's cause. There are women also who sacrificed their lives for our liberation, such as Songbird Mama Miriam Makeba, Mama Africa, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Mother of the Nation, Lillian Ngoyi, the great orator, Ruth First, Albertina Sisulu, and many others whose greatness still reverberate to this day. And as Professor Lamola has eloquently testified, Beyers Nodiers is one of such great stars in the constellation of great liberation figures. The question I would like to ask is, how does one even begin to speak about a person who defeated both himself and a pernicious, hateful culture? As our the guest speaker has shown, Nodier figuratively, and I want to use, undressed himself of the toxic leadership of the apartheid supporting church, as well as white identity along with its privileges. By taking off the robes, as it was said earlier on, of priesthood after his last sermon at the whites-only church that supported apartheid, Nodier publicly renounced the agenda of Afrikaner nationalism. There are many lessons that we glean from the life and work of Beyers Nodier, and once again, our guest speaker has highlighted how his life reinforces the values of honesty, truth, authenticity, integrity, deep sacrificial love, and transformational power of becoming a universal person. In addition of Prof. Lamola's invocation of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, I would like to make recourse to how Sartre's discussion, Being and Doing and Freedom, in his book, Being and Nothingness, helps to illustrate a critical aspect of Nodier's ethos, which I wish to draw serious attention to. According to Sartre, and I would like to quote him, to act is to modify the shape of the world. It is to arrange means in a view of an end. It is to produce an organized instrumental complex, such as by a series of concatenations and connections, the modifications effected on one of the links causes modifications throughout the whole series, and finally produces anticipated result, close quote. We can understand Sartre's words as vociferous denunciation of inaction, especially in action that occupies the body of a person who wants to see change, but who does not move to make the change come about. I would like to pose a question here. Are we comfortable in just being? Nodier was the person who was not limited by being, but a person inspired by doing. He bent reality. He modified reality. In so doing, he made his impact and contributed to the changing nation. One of the most iconic of Nodier's actions was how, after leaving office at the whites-only church, he went to serve in Alexandra. This was said earlier on, Township, an area that today typifies inequality, betrayal, struggling, neglect, with symbolic of the failure of the current government with regard to service delivery, transformation, and social injustice. The lesson we glean from him here is to serve and love those who are regarded as least in society, for that is where real transformation is needed. In a way, not just shocking, but powerful act says to us, where you see a need, take a lead. He took a lead to love, to change, to transform, and to teach. My response would be incomplete without providing commentary on the critical issue of greed and corruption as we seek to learn from Nodier's legacy. Indeed, as the guest speaker has noted, greed and corruption remain a malignant cancer in our nation. But this ought not to be normal. This embarrassing situation suggests that our nation is not only suffering from the poverty of food for our hungers and housing for shelter, but it is greatly suffering from the poverty of leadership. The selfish tendencies of certain individuals continue to stifle the promise of great South Africa that we have since been holding our breaths to see born again post-1994. South Africa, my country, is experiencing a delayed rebirth because of a few individuals who think that the leadership is an oligarchy event. As Bon Okri once observed, and while our corrupt and greed-driven leaders should be ashamed of themselves, we too should be ashamed when we do nothing about their crimes against our history and humanity. We ought to ask ourselves some difficult questions. I know Professor Lamola didn't want to get into them, but for me, it becomes very critical. Are state-owned institutions working effectively for the people, especially those in the hinterland of our country? Why are state-owned institutions failing to work effectively and justly for the masses? How do we bring about change and make sure that the institutions work and the great masses of our people enjoy the fruits of their votes and their citizenry? The last question, who must make sure that the institutions are effective in serving the people, if not the government? After all, we put them in power for that duty. As we celebrate New Day, we need to realize that the time has come to hold our leaders accountable. We must fight against the flow of party political service and push for the agenda of public service. For leadership is about followers and not the leader. I'm aware that there are those people who say that politics and corruptions will always go hand in hand. But we must reject this resignation and demand a new kind of politics that walks on the ground with the people. It is about time that we make clear to politicians that before you are a politician, you are a person. They must therefore reclaim their personhood, like Nudia, who undressed himself, as we have seen, in order to love, unify, and transform. Ben Okri once observed, and I want to quote him, we need a new social consciousness in Africa, in particular in South Africa. If there is any country in Africa that should lead the way of true transformation, it is South Africa. The time has come when we must band together and mend the brokenness of our humanity. We ought to bring about the primal communal philosophy of Africanness, which is collectivism. We must remember the Sepedi saying that goes, the lions that fail to work as a team struggle to bring down a wounded buffalo. It is time to undress ourselves of certain comforts that do not add to the collective value of our humanity. As I conclude, I would like to appreciate the Kagiso Trust for the great work they are doing, especially through their relationship with South African universities. As we remember Nudia today, permit me pose a few questions to our universities, not the University of Zululand. This is more generic. And I think as the University of Zululand, we have really done much in terms of the issues that I'll be raising here. Where is the place of universities in the South African human crisis? What place do universities occupy in the crusade of South African rebirth, in the renewal of humanness? Is ours a scientific philosophy without humanity? Or is it a human philosophy incorporating within itself the scientific? Another question, are our South African universities serving humanity? Or are they drunk of the language of hard sciences, robotics, and moon journeys? Now that Kagiso Trust is partnering with the universities, what the challenge has universities taken up as to serve our people in the most relevant, noble, and transformative way? Yes, the place of universities is enhancing human excellence, serving as a humanizing effect. There is a language of focusing on hard science, but we must not neglect the most important service that universities can offer humanity, which is helping eradicate the crisis of humanity, which are today faced in many respects. It is time to reform universities into academies of human excellence. Our lecture halls should bustle with the philosophical spirit of persons like Nudia, work for the people. I would like to warn that if the focus of our universities is only on science, humanity is slowly being annihilated. The focus on science only is a tragic illusion, and we need to refocus and refigure the fact that human life was not made for science, but science was discovered for humanity. Do not get me wrong, colleagues. There is nothing wrong with scientific endeavors, but there is everything wrong with a focus dedicated to science, while in the process, humanity is neglected. As we dream of a figure like Nudia, one prays that Nudia's spirit breathes into the nostrils of our almost fainted nation. Whereas Nudia sacrificed so much for unity, for love, for social work. He showed love for humanity irrespective of race. So let us each undress himself and herself for the other. This is a sacrifice that is not really a sacrifice, but a human obligation. As Ben Okri puts it, there is no sacrifice at the altar of love. I thank you again, and thank you, Professor Lamola.
Yeah, we must not forget to thank our stylish COVID protocol officer here, sister. Yeah, in order for one to do this job, one needs to be quick as well, because sometimes you'd find that a speaker shoots fast into the podium only to find that the protocol officer, cannot keep up. So in this instance, you've beaten all our guests. Thank you very much. Thanks to Prof for the challenges that you posed. And again, the warning that the focus, yes, should not be on science, but humanity as well. I noted what you said about us having to be politicians before we become activists or politicians. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we did say earlier on that we'll be taking questions to Professor Lamola and their comments as well. So for the next 7 minutes or so, I'm just going to take you through some of the questions that we've received on the portal. And by show of hand, again, we would like to take a few questions from the floor. So I will combine the questions, Prof, as well as the comments. So if you could please take note so you can accordingly respond. We have one comment. Someone says, Professor Lamola, I have heard you. Dr. Nudia also engaged in very constructive and mutually beneficial conversations with the members of the student Christian movement, influencing and being influenced. Thanks, Prof. Then we have another question. Thank you, Prof. Lamola, for your well-presented thoughts. The question I have for you, Prof, is how do we take this lecture to the nation, especially to our youth of today? They need to learn and internalize that being a human being is indeed an attainment. It is in our hands to strive for. And equally so this is the second question, how do we challenge today's body politic with the same message? Another one, in memory of Dr. Beyers Nudia, what is the critical developmental role that Kagiso Trust as a civil society organization can play in South Africa and Africa today and in future, noting the moral decay of our society and the alarming challenges faced by current democratic regimes. So this one is directed to Kagiso Trust. Another one, each time I listen to Dr. Beyers Nodia's memorial lecture, I get rejuvenated and encouraged to never forget, keep trying to serve the best possible way. Thank you, Professor Lamola, for the great presentation. And another one, what a comment you are making, my sister, this one is for Tissa, for referring to people as looters, kind of a way of belittling and demeaning them. Powerful comments. And another comment, the professor has crafted an incredible portrait of a pillar in the pattern of our freedom, namely Wombay, and the professor further challenges the current falsity that our liberation has created a better society. He, the professor, postulates the highest thought, which is espoused by John Paul Sartre, that which recreated bears to be human first, and only then you can be baptized to be authentic as bears became. So we have a combination of questions and comments. And I think this is the second last one. Thank you, Prof. Lamola, for the lecture. That was so spiritual. A question for you is the political party landscape of SA still relevant in rekindling and in the rebirth of selfless leadership? Yes, thank you very much. So these are some of the comments and questions. So I suppose in this order, the Prof is going to respond. And there was a question also and comments directed to Kagiso Trust. We will have Ms. Dooms respond to them. And after that, we will then take the hands. Should we then combine let's rather do that, yes, so that the speakers speak all at once, right? Do we have any comments or questions from the attendants here? No, we already have, yes, adequate and relevant. I see Prof. Siepe's hand is up there.
My question would be not so much only on Professor Lamola, but also Professor Masokha. It's more of a, you could say, intellectual and philosophical crisis. Every year, we listen to the heroic struggles of the people like Nelson Mandela. And I'm reminded of Nelson Mandela, who Professor Lamola referred to. And he said in that very speech that he gave in 1964, explaining himself why he chose the struggle and explaining the fact that he did not need communists to make him fight against apartheid. He located himself within the history of the anti-colonial struggle. And he said when he was a young person, he used to listen to the elders talk about the heroes in this anti-colonial struggle. And this is why in the end, he says that during my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to this African struggle. The question that is uppermost is that Mandela was saying, I heard these stories, and I wished that history would be so kind that I'll be part of that struggle. And history was kind or unkind to him because he became part of the struggle. But the one way in which you socialize an idea is through education. The question that Professor Masokha was also raising, how do we at university succeed, or how can we succeed to produce people who are as critical and who are as conscientized as Mandela and Wombay was or were? in taking or assuming that which Professor Lamola is saying, becoming human beings. I liked his play on the human being as an act of becoming. Because we cannot continue to celebrate the heroes of the past without having an impact in the social consciousness and the consciousness of our people. And at this point in time, the crisis we find within our universities must be located to the crisis in the classroom. Because when you speak, all of you, you quote John Sartre, you quote the German philosophers. But where are our philosophers in the classroom to make sure that our students, we produce a type of students who will not, at the slightest provocation, decide to break a hall, decide to get into acts of violence. So we need to take those lessons. But the apartheid regime and what it did was to make sure that its message is expressed in the classroom every day. When apartheid made us know that we are children of a lesser God, it was very clear that you will be taught from childhood that equality with Europeans or white people is not for you. It was written. How do we write that in our daily, beyond simply doing what Mandela said, that at least when I was young, I wish I could be part of the struggle. How can we make our students say today, we want to be that struggle, we want to be the type of human being that Professor Lamola had suggested. So that is more of a challenge, not only to us, but I would like you to start thinking about it in the same way that we were influenced by the German philosophers, by the French philosophers. How do we make sure that our students are influenced differently?
Thanks, Prof. Thank you very much. All right, we have to get the response. I think the next 5 minutes just for you, Prof, to engage and respond. Thank you.
I will steal this opportunity to thank the respondents for their insightful and inspirational comments on our delivery. On the questions, I'll summarize and again for the commentation, the commentaries that we have received from the virtual audience are also appreciated. And in response, I'll just summarize, picking up like 4 points. The first one being that beginning from the point raised by Professor Masukha, that we need, what is a lack in our educational culture is an understanding of the trajectory from the hard practical sciences that are preferred by the economy, etc., from engineering to science, to medical, biological sciences that are required for our health and so on, to social sciences like economics, where you go into humanities. And as you go up, there's philosophy and there's theology. Okay, philosophy and theology are fighting for historically, because they were said to be the queen of all sciences. What I deliberately decided to do today, or in this lecture, was to make philosophy a public subject, to have people to think and talk about philosophy. I deliberately engaged in the analysis of the concept of being, and in a way, Professor Siepe, that was a way of trying to stimulate our public consciousness and our public readership We are in a very dangerous phase of Twitterati, etc., where people enjoy shortcuts. You must quickly input 14 letters, you can say what you can say, and you have said what you have said. Serious thought requires a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, and a lot of reflection. So we need to break a problem that we have in our society, that we have a society that does not read. We do not read. Our children don't read enough. We do not read as South Africans generally, and it is worse that our culture of not reading has been overtaken by the internet culture and the handsets that we have on our hands that further encourages us to less read. So we are not going to have the Siepes, the Nengenkulus, the Makabelas, the Pichanas, the Bikos that we had in the 1970s now. We need maybe to find different ways of stimulating our students within the context of what we have. It's a challenge of philosophers of education. So, sir, your question is more rhetorical than anything else. It inspires us to move and to say more. The issue about action and individualism. Very ironically, Jean-Paul Sartre, the whole existentialist movement, when it emerged in France in the 1950s, there were public meetings where the French Communist Party were fighting Jean-Paul Sartre exactly by saying he is over-focusing on the individual and not on the social structures. And this I find a very interesting challenge, and it is linked to the other question of, is there hope that our current leadership can be turned from being selflessness? I still believe that the challenge to the individual still has a very strong balance. And I am saying this having been one who had grown up into the evangelical tradition initially, where I used to preach John 3, verse 16. Be ye born again, okay? And I was very careful not to go there. Hence, I hinged on to Sartre and to where I moved away from that into being a Marxist scholar. And today I have come back in this lecture because I believe there's still the road to Damascus. There's still a point where someone must cry. There is a point, it doesn't matter you are the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Health. Somewhere in your private room, your God must speak to you and say, but this is not right. Our problem is that we have politicians who do not cry. And we need that, whatever it takes. And it's not going to take the Das Kapital to make them to cry. It's going to take some spiritual, scriptural, or some wisdom to do that. Finally, Steve Biko's best writing, according to him, is an essay he wrote in 1973, Black Consciousness and the Quest for True Humanity. We never understood Biko, and only now we're understanding what he was trying to say. True humanity in capital T and capital H is exactly what we have been trying to talk about now. And Madame Dooms, Tessa referred a little bit to this, about how we as South Africans have had our humanity disfigured by apartheid, both black and white. And the struggle in the 1970s was a quest, the hunger, the quest, the thirst for the redemption, the recovery, the achievement of true humanity. And that concept of true humanity, Biko picked up from Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon was a student and an interlocutor with Jean-Paul Sartre, where they understood what they meant about what is to be a true human being. And in a way, Nodier was part of that reflection, if you think about his activity in the 1970s. So at the core of it is really true humanity? How do you drive with a shining tree, with a fleet of shining Mercedes Benzes in a squatter camp, driving through, sewage flowing through there? How can you ask yourself, how do these people live? From there, when after that I go and have my Johnny Walker Black Label, 18 years old. How does it work? How do we sleep? We need something is required. It doesn't need high level politics. I live on a farm outside of Gauteng, in Gauteng, outside of Pretoria. I used to drive to work to the University of Pretoria to teach. And on my way to the university, between the farm where I lived and the university, I used to pass through the squatter camp. Yeah. And passing through that camp informed when I stand in front of my students. I actually felt guilty because there will be all these high ideas, high this, and I'll listen because in the University of Pretoria, you have multiracial students will debate issues of race. And you'll have all these quotations about American so-and-so have said about race. So-and-so said about post-racialism. We must be aracial. And then what will be in my mind and what I will try to bring to them will be this squatter camp. I still call them squatter camp. We have institutionalized them into informal settlements. They are not informal settlements. They must be squatters because people should not be living there forever. But they have been turned into townships these days, anyway, which is another scandal. Anyway, without going into preaching again, all we're saying is the individual challenge, the sense of feeling needs to be restored into our body politic. And maybe, yes, there's a possibility that we can go back to that selflessness. That's why we need more women into South African politics. I believe that if we can have more mothers as leaders in our country, the politics of our country will change. And that's prophetic.
Professor Lamola, now we know what you drink when you get home, eh? Yes. I heard Professor Lamola saying that whether you are a Minister of Health or a Minister of Defense, at times you need to cry. I'm sure the Minister of Defense listening to you now will say, Gandhi, what do these people want from me? I thought I had already cried enough when I was allegedly held hostage for close to 3 hours. Well, Tisa, there was something raised about Kagiso Trust and how to take this forward. Thank you.
First. Yeah, this is a quick and an easy one for me. Talking about KT is one of my favorite pastimes. I think there are many roles that Kagiso Trust and civil society in general can play. I think one of the things about Kagiso Trust that we need to play a role in is teaching civil society how to be self-sustaining. We come from a culture of civil society that is about responding to what's happening, and it's very kind of reactive and also dependent on donors, and especially in the last 20 years, this kind of culture of particularly international donors being the ones that fund and therefore dominate the agenda of civil society in the country. And I think Kagiso Trust's focus on being a sustainable entity that self-funds is a lesson that I think we need to be able to teach in the space. But also thinking about civil society as modeling what needs to be done with solutions rather than pointing out problems. We are long past the point where pointing out the problem is enough. And I always say to young people when we give them opportunities to be in the room with people who are in power, is use the opportunity to say what must be done rather than what must not be done. Because we must be solutions oriented. And I believe that we're trying to create models that demonstrate what solutions could look like through the work that we do at Kagiso Trust. But I think the final thing, and I think we've been grappling with this, at least for the last 2 years, very palpably within Kagiso Trust, is this question of values and bringing back a sense of being a values-driven society and asking ourselves, you know, where do we derive our sense of morality from? How do we get a shared morality? My fellow trustees are for the most part people who fought for the country's liberation. And there's increasingly a sense, not of disquiet, but of disgust that is palpable amongst us. And that's driving us to say, there's a bigger question here than governance. And the bigger question is values. And I hope that we are able to contribute to the values conversation, not just the policy conversations.
Thank you, Professor Masocha.
Yes, no, thank you very much for that question, Professor Sepe. Just three things, and I think Professor Lamola did a good job in attempting to respond to that, though he qualified that as a rhetoric question. But my sense tells me that even if it's a rhetoric question, but it needs to be asked every time when we do our business. It needs to be asked. And I think it would actually bother us in terms of talking about issues of relevance. And there are two things, and I know that today, Professor Lamola, we've been talking about being, but there's also another very key philosophical concept, which is presence. It's the being and presence. And I have actually, in my experience and history as a lecturer and researcher for many years, and I've been interacting with students who strongly feel that they are not present in what we teach and what we assess. Our universities, and I'm not talking University of Zululand, get me right, because I think we're working along this issue, because I know we've got the African thought business as the University of Zululand. That's what we're working on in terms of our strategic direction of the university. But this issue of excluding ourselves from what we are doing is a big crisis. We are really grappling with very serious issues. It's about being and presence. And they're not present, and they feel that they're excluded from what we are teaching and what we are preparing them to do. That is the biggest issue. Now, the second issue is about, one of the luminaries is the late Professor Stilwan, and I've actually done work on him, who talks about Moto Kimudi. A human being is perennially, and I'm trying to translate it, divine. Now, what Professor Lamola was saying, in my community, when the community decides to say you are no longer human, you are an animal in terms of our community standards. So if you are now pushed by the community to a level of being an animal, how to polo? So what you should strive for, and I think the point that he's talking about politicians and leaders, when they don't care whether they actually go to a level of being now animals because of greed, that shows a crisis that we're all faced with in this case. And I think that's one of the things that we should be working on. But the other issue that we have not looked at, Professor Lamola, is one of the institutions that should be giving us hope is also becoming problematic, is the church. If the church is also now looking like those institutions that are problematic, then where should we run to? If looting is even happening, and I'm sorry, Tessa, to use the term looting, or stealing rather, happening in the church, where's our hope? Because the crisis that we find ourselves in, it's even a crisis in the institutions that are supposed to be driving hope and assurance. But those are the institutions that are actually now destroying our communities. So, and Professor Sepe, I think, yeah, I'm finishing to say the question that you're asking is that it's now the question is about relevance. It's about the material we are actually using for students. What is it that they are reading and how do we teach them? Because as much as we appreciate Sartre, but I have a feeling that there are other luminaries, even though they might not have actually produced books, that we should be introducing in our classes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Masocha, and thanks to Ms. Dooms as well, and Professor Lamula responding. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are coming to the penultimate part of the program. So I'm going to kindly request the VC to come to the podium, joined by the Kagiso Trust CEO, Ms. Moitse. I'm going to ask them to come forward. They have an item to render before we go to the vote of thanks. The presentation of gifts.
Okay, here we come. For all your sins, Professor Lamula, you come here to us. For the statement you have made that women should take over, we have decided to come and to lift you up as our hero. And UniZulu would like to present this to you, Professor, for the inspiring and motivating lecture that you delivered today. So, like you to take us. Yes, would like you to take us, take UniZulu with you, and think of us as we move forward and take this country forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looking at the size of that portrait, Prof, they're going to have to get a private jet for you, eh? The Beyers Naudé lecture is all about the values and the participation that we had, not only from our speakers, but I could see that it got us as a nation rejuvenated, and there were a lot of sentiments that arose from this activity. So it is pertinently befitting that we get a response from the family of Ombe, which is why I'm requesting speak on behalf of the family, Mr. Johan Naudé, to extend words of appreciation on behalf of the family. Thank you.
Madam Vice, the members of the Zululand University, Kagiso Trust and all their dignitaries, and special the students, which is the youth, and who we appreciated, which we actually, at the moment, that we envisage that they must definitely start taking over completely. That's with this appreciation of the Beyers-Naudé family that we thank you for hosting these Beyers-Naudé memorial services. Now, in us as Afrikaners, a memorial service is something which is a little bit not kosher. It's like a funeral and so forth. But these memorial services which you're hosting, it's nothing like a memorial services. It's something wonderful, a wonderful happening in the future and the future for our country. Now, my appreciation at the moment is actually to appreciate Beyers-Naudé. And this time I want to call him the person who listened and led by example. The year 2003, which we saw here on the screen, suddenly springs to mind. If I'm not mistaken, it was the first year, and it was then said, was the first year that the Cherished Trust inaugurated the first Beyers-Naudé Memorial Lecture. We as a Beyers-Naudé family are looking forward to still being part of the 21st anniversary of the Beyers-Naudé occasions in the year 2024. We're looking forward to that. Now, reflecting on Professor Lamola's message of today reminded me, and unfortunately I haven't read it, but I will definitely go ahead and read it, is that his documentary history of the church struggle against apartheid, 1960 to 1990. He's taken it much further today, but then he called that, named it Sowing in Tears. Now, me being a civil engineer, but coming from the family, I looked up and it reminded me of Psalm 126, verse 5 and 6, which is also say sowing in tears. That's where it came and it changed into a psalm of joy, where God restored the fortunes of Zion. I'm going to read it. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing the sheaves with him. Now the question is, did Beyers-Naudé sow in tears? And did he, after bearing the seed for sowing, leave us with shouts of joy? That's a question which we must look at, because if he's not lived that for that, whatever we do today here is irrelevant. I'm very certain that he left us with the legacy of him sowing with tears, and those tears turned into tears of joy. Beyers-Naudé had the achievement that he was always prepared to listen, especially to the pleas of the youth. By doing this, he suddenly realized that he will have to get involved in the then struggle. He now became a true African of the soil of Africa. He was liberated from the nationalistic and political isolation, taking up the fight for the rights of the people at grassroots level. The more he listened, the more he realized that he must give more of himself. So the sowing of his commitment started. In doing so, he earned the respect and friendship of the young, the old, the peoples of our multicultural rainbow nation of this diversified country of ours. I'm often asked how he became involved in the struggle. Who and what inspired Beyers-Naudé to respond to the cries and needs of our country? We've heard about the road to Damascus. When did Beyers realize that he was on the wrong road to Damascus? It's not always that you're on your way to Damascus, you might not be on the right road, you're on the wrong road. Then I hereby quote Beyers. At a conference in Uppsala, Switzerland, the students from South Africa demanded from me to provide proof from the scriptures how anyone could validate the then apartheid laws and views, close quote. He then suddenly realized that he had to travel abroad in order to be confronted by situations of injustice in his own country. What do you do about it? It was after his return that he started to meet with black and colored youths in the townships around Gauteng to gain practical feedback for what he was told overseas. He then publicly began to question in his own mind the morality of the apartheid government. All right, now how did the sewing play a role in the struggle, and what was the extent of his involvement? We have heard about the Sharpeville massacre. After the Sharpeville massacre, Beyers founded the Christian Institute, which we heard in 1963. It was an ecumenical organization with the aim of fostering reconciliation through interracial dialogue. We're still busy with that. We haven't managed to solve that. And they also did, as we heard, different research and publications like Sprocus and all the different ones, which eventually all were banned at that time. Now, this Beyers not being a businessman, more in the scriptures, you know, he then soon realized that if the black community does not become economically independent, white supremacy will exist forever. We haven't reached that goal yet either. Therefore, he played a prominent part in the establishment of Kagiso Trust, Kagiso Investment, as well as Tebi Investments. Both these companies became economical and powerful, who now improve the daily lives of our people at grassroots level. The track record of Tebi, the track record of Kagiso proves for itself. If you will take some time and study Kagiso's growth from the start, when it started and what they do now, it's multi-billion. Look, nowadays we talk in billions. There's no more money, rands and so forth. If you take some money, wherever it is, and you work with it, it must be billions. Now, it's no wonder that our beloved stalwart Nelson Mandela wrote at Beyers' funeral, quote, "Beyers reminds me above all of the journey that I had to make from being in my own mind a member of a smaller community of people towards becoming a member of an increasingly bigger human family. That is a journey so many of us had to undertake in many different ways, and we still have to do that." Now, this is a story of a man being a true South African who was prepared to listen. But let us ask ourselves the question, what Beyers would really have wanted to achieve by listening, sowing, and reaping joy, the joy of his tearful work, because it was not, there was smiles involved, but I think most of the time it was tears. Let us take a few songs out of his hymn book. That we must respect our fellow men, irrespective of color or creed. That we must respect our elders, irrespective of who they are. That we must respect the culture of different peoples. What does it give us? Then we will enjoy the friendship of the young, the old, the peoples of the multicultural rainbow nation of this diversified country. Further, we must contribute to the advancement of fairness, justice, and peace for all. I know you've heard it every time, but we must remind ourselves of what we should go for and what was in his hymn book. We must strive to create a non-racial and just society not only for South Africa, but for the complete African continent. Because we are part of Africa. We have to drive Africa. We must also strive for justice, liberation, And we must strive for recognition of human dignity and self-respect for all the peoples of Africa. Then, naturally, what must follow, which we all feel should happen, is we must strive to narrow the dividing gap between the rich and the poor. Now let's wrap up. Here we have a wise old man, a deeply religious man, who in simple-minded obedience to the Lord obeyed his conscience rather than man. Now, let's look at it again. He was a person who heard, he listened to the plight of the vulnerable, and what did he do? He acted on it. He was a person who had empathy for people, who cared for his fellow men, you and me, and he's still caring for us, who had confidence in the future, because we wouldn't have been here if we haven't got confidence in the future of our country. And the most important thing, who led by example. Now, I know I said it last time, previous lectures, is that Beyers always asked that he must not be honored with accolades, but rather in years to come, the following will become known. And it was mentioned that we are here in the rural KwaZulu-Natal. So he said he would rather like to be honored this way, that the people of each, and I'm quoting it, that the people of each of the remote African villages will, through one of their folklores, would tell their grandchildren that there once was a wise old man who was prepared to listen to the needs of the people and did something about it, who led the way by example and opened the eyes of the different nations, cultures, and peoples of the continent of Africa and our country, South Africa. Now, this message of a wise old man is here to be given to the youth of this university. And I'm going to mention it again. The message of today is for the youth, who must be prepared to listen to all the people and then proceed to do something together with everybody about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nadia. That young man did not need my hand to get off the podium. Thank you very much. Now we understand the Kagiso Trust is working on a project that will document the life of Ombe into a movie. So please, before they can do auditions, as a member of the family, please raise your hand. You can play the part very well with the resemblance and the height as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Nadir. Now I am going to request our CEO from Kagiso Trust, who is going to do a vote of thanks, Ms. Mankonde Moitse.
We can be born again. There can be rebirth. I think we are honored today in these challenging times for each one of us to be sitting here. And be given a stirring inside us that it can be done. Program Director, Mr. Alex Mutiani, the Vice Chancellor, Prof. Mtose, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Prof. Siepe, our guest of honor, Prof. John Lamola, our discussant and trustee of Kagiso Trust, Metesa Dooms, Professor Masoha, the Kagiso Trust Board that I know they are watching virtually, the chair of the trust, and our Kagiso Trust trustee with us today, Dean Nevutalu, present with us, the students of the university. Ladies and gentlemen, it's still good morning. When Beyers Naudé passed in 2009, he was 89. And the former president of our country, Mtate Nelson Mandela, said in tribute to him, Beyers Naudé became an outcast amongst the Afrikaners, many amongst the whites and among the church that he loved. Such is a price that the prophet are prepared to pay. Standing in the tradition of great Afrikaners and patriots like Bram Fischer, Betty du Toit, and many others, his life is a shining beacon to all South Africans, blacks and white. It demonstrates what it means to rise above race, to be a true South African. If someone asked me, that was Mr. Mandela, if someone asked me, what kind of a person a new South Africa should be, he said, I will say, take a look at Beyers and his wife, Elsie. We as Kagiso Trust are immensely honored, immensely proud of Ombey, the foundation that he laid in early years of this organization. We are a beneficiary of the legacy that he left. He showed us to serve others, never stop caring, to maintain a sense of dedication and stay true to our convictions. He showed us what it meant to be a true South African. Our vision, when we wake up every morning and think of the South Africa we want to see, we see it as a prosperous, we see it as an equitable, we see it as a just society. The values that underpin this, we strive to be a people of integrity. We want to be accountable. We want to be accountable. You know, the people that started Kagiso Trust are not shareholders in Kagiso Trust. Johan was talking about it, that they started the Tebe Foundation, they started the investment companies that drives the work, the amounts of billions that he's talking about, and they're not shareholders. At the end of the year, they don't get a check of a dividend. They didn't leave it to their family, they left it to South Africa. So we have to be accountable. We have to account, even when we're not seen. We have to have passion for development. We have to be hands-on and have a bottom-up approach. Not do things for the people, but do it with them. I would like to thank the University of Zululand. Professor Ntombela, thank you so much, ma'am, the Dean of Education here, for partnering and hosting the Beyers Naudé Lecture once again here since 2017. Thank you, Program Director, for a job well done. We also thank Professor Masoha, thank you, sir, and Metesa for responding with such eloquence to you, the Naudé family. I had a privilege of driving around with you. You embody this legacy with such dignity. Thank you. Every year. To our special Professor John Lamola, your words were inspiring and they deeply resonate with us. Sometimes we think about it, but we don't take it to the end it deserves. I hope the call you have made us to stop and truly start taking action. Thank you for making this memorial lecture a fitting tribute to Ombe, and I'm sure he is smiling above and nodding his head. Let me also thank the communications team and the management that have arranged and worked so tirelessly to make this space to happen. To all those who attended this lecture, both physically and virtually, I'm sure we have taken a great deal today. Our country needs us to reset our moral compass and remember the ideals, the convictions, the actions of the struggles of those who have gone before us and sacrificed to make us have this South Africa as a free nation. Like the chairperson of Kagiso Trust said, what would Beyers Naudé do? What would Ombe do? To all of you here today, thank you so much and a big thank you for being part of this lecture in 2021. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Moitse, I know that you're extending the thank yous to everyone who participated, and we also have to thank you as well for wrapping up formally the events. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the 2021 Beyers Naudé lecture, which was done by Kagiso Trust in partnership with the University of Zululand. Just an announcement between the teams, Kagiso and the university, we will have a mini photo shoot after this, and then lunch will be served where we had breakfast earlier. But can imagine for those joining us visually, what must be going on in their mind when the program director is making announcements about lunch and all of that. But the benefit that they had was throughout, we could not even snack. We were sitting here attentively. Them watching visually, they had the benefits of going in and out, refresh, stress, switch off the microphone and all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, give yourself a big round of applause. Thank you. Right. As the other guests proceed to have lunch, we would like to request our speakers to come for a photo moment on stage, all our speakers. And for our guests, you'll be led into where to have lunch.